Alright, welcome to the last video lecture for this chapter. This chapter deals with problem-solving courts. These are courts that specialize in an area like veterans, mental health, domestic violence, drugs, juveniles. So there are some distinguishing features of problem-solving courts. One is that they have this need for enhanced information. They look for knowledge about the condition that landed the offender in the court. So knowledge about substance abuse and how it changes your brain, knowledge about violence and who engages in violence. Problem-solving justice also kind of looks at community engagement, it looks at collaboration, it looks at which is very different from other courts who are not as focused on the community. Problem-solving courts also emphasize accountability and outcomes. So they're evaluated on the accountability and outcomes for victims and offenders in their court. So this is not necessarily move as many cases through the process as quickly as we can. It's let's address each and every offender and victim that we work with. And so these courts are based on restorative justice. We kind of have a goal to repair harm, restore the community, and we process things a little differently. So your specific chapter in your book focuses on drug courts, domestic violence courts, and juvenile courts. So starting with drug courts, drug courts got started because we saw a huge increase in the amount of offenders in courts based on drug use. Drug use was related to other criminal acts frequently, and so drug courts have this goal of integrating treatment and principles of the criminal justice system. They are non-adversarial. The goal is not to kind of pit two sides against each other, and there is an attempt to identify eligible participants very early in the process. Once someone gets into drug court, there's this kind of focus on treatment and rehabilitation. There's a coordinated strategy with multiple different parties involved. There is required treatment. Usually oftentimes there's group meetings, there's individual meetings, there is rehabilitation, there might be job and educational training, there's frequent drug testing, and all this results in this very coordinated strategy and high levels of interaction between drug court staff and the participant. So the question is, well, does it work? In the research, we measure it working by looking at are the participants that are diverted or assigned to drug courts, do they stay there, do they recidivate, and do they achieve sobriety? And the research has a little methodology inconsistent. The researchers measure and evaluate things a little differently, but on the whole, the findings are very positive. They show us that participants are finishing the programs, they are less likely to commit future crimes, and that they are achieving sobriety. Also, the research tells us that drug courts are fairly cost-effective. They are less expensive than prosecuting and incarcerating someone for drug offenses. So the other court in this chapter is domestic violence courts. Domestic violence courts kind of started in the mid-1990s where we got some funding for the federal government provided funding in the Violence Against Women's Act. Domestic violence courts have a goal to ensure the victim's safety. That's one of their top goal is to ensure victim's safety and the safety of her children, his or her children, and to hold the offender accountable for their violence. This is very different from other specialty courts because there's this huge emphasis on victim safety. There's a tailored intervention for offenders. Offenders are monitored, they're held accountable for their actions, they're frequently required to attend like batterer intervention programs. One noted problem when dealing with domestic violence cases is offenders are just thrown into anger management, which is not as helpful as targeting a batterer as a batterer and getting them specialized treatment. Also, domestic violence courts are less likely to dismiss a domestic violence case than a regular criminal court, which if you look through courts, you'll see very high rates of dismissals for domestic violence in regular criminal courts, while these courts actually are processing their caseload. So there's a little less research about whether or not domestic violence courts work, but the research that does exist does show that they appear to be effective. They do move cases through, they do adequately assess and provide treatment, and victims report positive experiences in the courthouse themselves, which is drastically different than how victims report their experience in criminal courts. Okay. So other types of problem-solving courts, there's community courts. These frequently focus on quality of life offenses like prostitution or misdemeanors. There also are veterans courts. There is a veterans court in Indiana in Anderson. These treat issues that veterans have based on their service, their time overseas, and they also generally are successful. There are also homelessness courts, which help the homeless with minor criminal cases, try to help them find a place to live and job training and things like that. Now, mental health courts also exist. They provide mental health services as an alternative to incarceration. And there's a collaboration between mental health experts and court experts to try and help the offender. There also are re-entry courts, which supervise parolees who are returning to their communities after a period of incarceration. They provide oversight and support services with the goal of reducing recidivism. But the most common problem-solving court, the most well-known problem-solving court, are juvenile courts. Juvenile courts have the authority to act in place of the parents. Their goal is to preserve the best interests of each child. So they protect the child, guide the child through the process. Juvenile courts started in 1899, and they have undergone a lot of changes. Juvenile courts, their courts of limited jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction is based on the age of the child in state statutes. They have this emphasis on treatment and rehabilitation, and they have this goal of reducing recidivism. Now, juvenile courts are separate courts. Juveniles who are in juvenile courts receive an overrepresentation between Black youth and white youth, underrepresentation for Asian youth and Hispanic youth. Juvenile courts operate in a quasi-civil, quasi-criminal middle ground. If the child is found guilty, which we would call that adjudicated delinquent, juvenile courts are less formal. They are not public, and there's almost never a jury trial in juvenile courts. Juveniles can be transferred out of juvenile court to criminal court. We have seen increased rates of transfer with increased number of juvenile crimes. Sometimes juveniles cannot be in juvenile court because of a certain type of crime. For instance, homicides in Indiana are not tried in juvenile court based on statutes. So when we're looking at transfer criteria, Judges are looking at the juvenile's age, the offense type. Here they're looking at more serious offenses or offenses that are violent, aggressive, premeditated. Juvenile courts look at the juvenile's maturity and sophistication. Have they their record and history? Have they exhausted the resources of a juvenile court? And the likely outcomes when they're deciding whether or not to move a juvenile from from juvenile court to adult court. Sentencing in juveniles who are sentenced in adult criminal courts usually have harsher outcomes than they would have gotten in juvenile court. They're actually treated more harshly than adults of similar crimes. They usually get longer sentences than adults would. And Black and Hispanic youth are sentenced much more harshly than white youth who are transferred over. So there are some problems with juvenile courts, particularly with transfers. We may not be doing justice or fairness here. The last thing to note is the discussion board that was up on February 28th. The Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court gave her State of the Court speech, and many of you commented on Indiana's focus on specialized courts. So this chapter kind of provides an overview of a little bit about some of those courts, but there's a ton of other resources out there. If this is something you're interested in, you're passionate about, if you hope to work in a veterans court or a drug court or juvenile court, definitely encourage you to know that this is just a tiny overview of what's out there on these types of courts. All right, this was our last chapter. I hope you enjoyed the material.